G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and this is a video where we're going to be talking about designing your own environment concept pieces. Now, we're going to go from the very beginning. We're going to talk about brainstorming and coming up with an idea and an aesthetic. We're going to talk about exploring elements of design and creating a unique look and style. We're then going to create a few concept sketches and then we're going to talk about refining those into one final concept sketch for the environment that we've created. So it's going to be a bit of a process. Before we get started, I'm going to mention that this tutorial is created in conjunction with a competition now happening on By Artist for Artists. So it's part 3 of the group collaboration challenge, where part 3 is environment design. So for those of you who are interested and feel like you might learn enough from this tutorial to participate, or that perhaps environment design is your strong suit and you want a chance at winning $100 cash and being a part of a finished group collaboration, go over to By Artist for Artists, click the annotation on the screen or the link in the description to go over to the video explaining the prerequisites for entry and how to participate, and you can have a chance at winning a bit of cash and being a part of that project. So anyways, getting started, the first thing we're going to talk about is the brainstorm and research process. This process is as vital to the creation of your environment as anything else. If you're creating a concept environment for a game or for someone else's animation or something like that, you tend to need to know exactly what parameters you're working around, how much freedom do you have. Often when you're doing client work for other people, this area has already been done for you. They want something very specific, and so you have the brainstorm and research, as it were, already done, and you can immediately go to style exploration. So this phase comes in 2 parts, obviously, because it's brainstorm / research, and basically it entails coming to terms yourself with what the end product has to be, and then also looking up sort of ideas as to what other people have done with similar aesthetics, and this really helps when leading into the next part, which is style exploration. Now, environments are interesting because they tell the story as much, if not even slightly more, than your main character or your main plotline or anything like that, because this is where the scene is set. Often we have introductory shots where we see the dystopian city crumbling apart, or we see the utopian society thriving, or we see a medieval town under attack, or something like that. Any of these are great examples as to how in one shot we can see immediately where this thing takes place, whatever it is, the story, the game, whatever. There are lots of different hots and colds. Is this environment dystopian or is it utopian? That means dystopian being falling apart, crumbling and apocalyptic, or utopian thriving and perfect. And often that utopian is a facade to a dystopia. So often, for example, in something like The Island, in a movie like The Island, the utopia is the island place that they want to go, but that's a front for the dystopian world that these people live in. Is the environment old or new? Meaning essentially, is it medieval? Is it archaic? Is it caves? Is it something that brings to the viewer ideas of ancient, peoples or cultures, or is it something unexplored yet? Or is it modern? Is it today? So that's something that we can talk about in terms of environment. There's the chronology of it. Is it dark or bright? Does your environment need to convey a feeling of unease or a sense of looming evil or despair? Or is it a place of peace and serenity? Is the environment saturated with color? That's essentially when we're talking about a place that's almost Fae-esque, over-the-top colors, or is it so desaturated in color that it's almost entirely sepia or black and white? So these are sort of things you can work around as well, because these are a huge part of the style in conveying the story and mood of what your environment is. Is your environment going to be grand or is it going to be small? These are also quite important as well. So for example, if you're the environment designer for a movie like Lord of the Rings, you know that in your environment design, in your concept sketches, you need to include things like very small people to show the scale of the extremely large city. Use things like foreground and background to convey that sense of distance. So there's a lot of things that we need to keep in mind in that sense, both in terms of how we convey it and in terms of how it is a part of the story, because scale is a huge important aspect. If we're designing an environment for a game or a movie or an animation that is grand and huge, then we need to convey that properly to make sure that the narrative is being shared properly. The other thing too is you don't want to go over the top when something is actually more intimate, more smaller scale. So these are just a few of the things that you can brainstorm. You can take these things and we can come up with a bit of a concept. So I've got my dot points over there on the left and I'm going to come up with an environment myself. So an example as to how I might take these dot points and apply them to an environment I'm designing. Let's, for example, build one from the beginning. And I'm going to build an environment based around a world where knights and medieval type things are robotic. So let's just do something really mishmashy and interesting and see what we can come up with. So first things first, we need to know the facts about the place. If we're going for a medieval style mixed with a world of technology, I want to take that idea and I want to expand it into an aesthetic. Now, what is an aesthetic? An aesthetic is basically, the way I think of the word is an artistic feel. It's what that visual representation of whatever it may be invokes in terms of emotion, in terms of narrative, in terms of a visual appeal, both in color, in form and style. All of these things make up the aesthetic of the piece. So here we're talking about the aesthetic of a theme. We're talking about this medieval style in a world of technology. Is it dystopian or utopian? It could be either. It could be that these robot knight things have taken over and built things their own way, or it could be that they are the creation of people and everything has thrived because they defend and things like that. So we're going to create our own sort of theme, and let's go for just somewhere in the middle. It's just the way it is, and it's neither dystopian or utopian. It's just the functional norm. Is it old or new? Well, aesthetically speaking, I'm going to say old, because with this medieval style but the world of technology thing, if we go too new, it's going to be a bit too shiny, and I think that will take away from the medieval feel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say old style, though I'm going to be using a mix of metals and stone and sometimes wood, and the metals will be sort of cast iron looking and sort of as if they were beaten in an anvil. Is the tone dark or bright? Well, I'm just going to say medium brightness, and I'm going to say low saturation. That essentially means that there won't be a huge amount of color because there's stone and metal, which are both sort of gray, black and whitish in tone. Color is going to be quite minimal. So when color is introduced, whether it be the blue of royal banners or the color of the sky or grass or whatever may be present, I won't make it too saturated. I won't make it too bright green. I'll tone it down a bit to mix in with this mechanical feel of the world and the stone medieval darker feel of the world. Then in terms of scale, I want this to be grand. So we've already got here our finished concept. We've got this idea of a medieval style world of technology, functional norm, it's old style, medium sort of brightness, low saturation, and it's very grand in scale. That already is enough to begin. And that's the brainstorm part finished. The next part is the research part. This is where we get our good old friend Google and we type in things that we think might be associated with our theme. So for example, I would type something like medieval robot. And then when I go to images, I can just scroll through and see what appeals to me. So for example, if I open up this, I think this has an interesting sort of look to it. We can see that it's that sort of medieval feel and it's armor and stuff, but it's not actually on a human. It's probably not robotic enough. I'd like to see a few more nuts and bolts in there, but for now, I'm just going to save this image in my reference folder. Now, and there you go. It's quite as simple as that. I just right click and open a new tab whenever I find an image that I think is suitable to the aesthetic that I'm going for. This is kind of cool. Just be really rough and sort of, you know, you don't need to be too strict about it. And let's say I've got medieval robot, but I want to have some city images because in the end we're doing an environment. So I'm going to look up medieval robot city. Here's a cool sort of environment looking piece. We're just finding things that have a similar aesthetic. It doesn't necessarily have to have the details we want, and we're not going to necessarily copy things exactly as they are, but we do want to get elements of aesthetic and use them as inspiration. Maybe take bits and pieces here and there and combine them into something that we find interesting. Just try every now and then changing around the words and getting a different result. So for example, I can look up medieval steampunk city and that looks kind of cool. What have we got here? That looks pretty cool, the way it's sort of built. Even though this image here is a Minecraft sort of build, it also has an aesthetic, and we might gain something interesting from that. So I'm going to save this image as well, because the way the building is constructed, so top heavy, might suit the sort of futuristic, cramped for space feel that we might be going for. So we just save these, and you can see that my reference folder sort of built up a bit. It doesn't necessarily have to exactly fit the theme. So for example, this feels more Renaissance, steampunk, but there might be elements of this. It might even just be simply the way buildings are stacked, or the way the colors are, you know, flowing throughout the image, that we end up wanting to use. So now that I've got my reference images, I'm going to move over to the next stage of my creation process, and that is my style exploration. Now this is where we take elements of what we know we want to be in our final concept and just kind of muck around a bit, right? So let's say we want a finished piece which shows this city off in the distance with some elements of that world, and maybe space in the front left for a robot kind of to be standing there. I want to explore the elements of this piece that I know will be there in the final piece. So for example, in the tower that I might have in the middle of the city, let's say we begin over here with just a normal sort of medieval looking tower. So we really just roughly sketch in what the really vanilla version of it might be, and then think to ourselves, okay, so let's muck around a bit. Let's open up our reference files and look at what they do differently and things that I can add and change. Also, don't be afraid to just totally go in opposite directions. Try domes, try squares, or completely different shapes, and just really muck around before you start settling down on one thing, because this is the place where we need to try different things, explore, and find something new and interesting, because we need to present to the viewer something new and interesting as well. We're going to start talking about elements of this. So for example, a normal castle wall would look like this. And we know that when we see that sort of shape, viewers think to themselves, okay, medieval. All right, so because we're going medieval futuristic, what can we add to this very normal silhouette to make it convey future as well as medieval? So we might have this wall. What can we add to it? Well, an obvious thing is cogs, because we maintain that sort of rigid look. We get these sort of bumps out, but it also is a more futuristic thing. It's also very kind of synonymous with steampunk, and so much so that it's a cliche that it's almost a bit of a joke. If you just want to do steampunk, just add cogs to it, even though they might not have any function whatsoever. Either way, it's an element of visual design that might be useful when mixing these sort of genres and communicating something to the viewer. Something else that you might want to keep in mind are things like pistons or pumps, steam vents. So we might want to add this vent here and have some steam coming out. We might want some grates. So for example, if I have this sort of thing here with grates and have some oozing stuff out the side, and if this oozing stuff is green and neon looking, it all of a sudden looks like toxic waste that isn't necessarily present in medieval stories. So that's the kind of thing that we can explore. We want to look at really different things to incorporate, and we want to do them in a visually interesting way, because obviously if I have a wall, I'm not going to chuck on an oozing grate, a cog, and a steam vent. But my point is, you want to find ways to fit it into the environment. Think in ways that they would fit into the story. So if there were oozing grates, where would they go? Would they be on the outer edges of the city? For example, if the city layout was this square area and there was a big tower in the middle and a tower over here and, you know, whatever, big tower over here, would there be, for example, these outlets off onto the cliff that are oozing, you know, that sort of thing? Or would there be this massive gate here with huge cogs behind it to let open the bridge over the, what do you call it? What's that middle thing? Moat. The moat. Okay, it took me long enough. Sometimes my brain takes like half an hour to catch up. The other thing to keep in mind too is that there are three elements of the image that I'm going to be working with, my foreground, midground, and background. In my midground will be this castle and the cityscape. In the very background will be the horizon. So what will the horizon be? Will it be valleys and cliffs and hills, or will they be silhouettes of other distant cities, or the endless landscape of these futuristic castles that are covered in cogs and vents and all that, you know? So these are things that all help create the aesthetic. The other thing too, of course, is our foreground. So while it may not be our job to design the characters, as a concept designer, as an environment designer, we do want to show that there's a place for a character in the front left, also to give a sense of scale. So if I have a character in the front left that I might just roughly design to be based on a medieval helmet, but make him sort of robotic. So let's shape him out in an unrealistic way so that we know that a person is not inside the helmet. Give it that sort of cog medieval look, shade it a bit. And again, keep in mind that it doesn't need to be overly detailed, and because it's in the foreground, we'll probably end up shading it to the point where it won't be fully recognized. We just kind of want to add a sense of scale. So we might add things like the shoulder pads and have the chest plate come in, and then have it empty in the middle, and you know, you get the idea. So this is what I might be mucking around with in the foreground, and then using that, I might want to put characters in the midground that give a sense of scale. So let's say this is a house in the midground. If this is my house in the midground and I want to have a character next to it, it would be obviously about this size. That would be the character size. But if it's a castle or something like that, or even just a house because I've drawn it, and I draw a character that size, much smaller, then obviously we get a very different sense of scale. And I know I'll have to change these door sizes to be much more fitting, and you know, all of a sudden the sense of scale is dramatically changed because we have a reference in the front, we have a reference in the midground, and we can see those variances, right? So we're letting the viewer very immediately and quickly make these decisions about what's happening. So in our style exploration, I'm not going to spend too much time exploring this style, but I'm just kind of giving you an idea as to the process. It's very loose and relaxed. We're just going to muck around. We take elements of things and we throw them together, see what works and see what doesn't, take what works, expand upon it, and then move forward. And once we've got our style exploration fully explored to a point that we're happy to kind of move forward, our next step is the concept sketches. Now, when I say the concept sketches, I'm essentially going to be taking this square and I'm just going to copy it a couple of times. And we want to muck around with how we want to lay it out. So these are just our really, really rough ideas. So the first idea that I immediately have in my mind I'm going to work with, but then I want to break away from that just to test myself. So for example, I wanted a sketch where there was a figure in the front left that was quite clearly medieval looking, perhaps a guard holding a spear, something like that, making sure he looks robotic enough. And then we're going to use him as a reference for the distance, where we have, let's say, an army of a whole bunch of little figures, and we have this horizon with a road leading off to a city. So we have the road winding off and showing this sense of scale dramatically being pulled off into the distance. We might have a house in this sort of midground area and some smoke coming out of the chimney. And we can see that obviously that house is a certain scale compared to those people next to the house and this guard at the front. And then we might want to add some houses off here in the distance and show the sense of scale dramatically being worked with and increased to the point where we know that when we get to the castle off here in the horizon, these towers are massive because a house is about the size of a pixel. This tiny little house. So we know that when we get close to it later, it might be huge, right? And we know that this giant gate is beyond giant. It's just colossal in size because these are houses dotting the outside of it, and that's how big it is, you know? And so there are other approaches we can take as well. We can get closer to it. We might want to not use this as an establishing shot, but use the castle itself and see how we can create a sense of scale from that. But we might want to then, you know, build towers around here, have one main tower off here to the side with its own other towers, and it's just huge. And then just kind of get a skyline which has that sort of city look to it, right? So we get these buildings that look like skyscrapers, when in reality we know they're medieval buildings because of the setting that we're creating. We can also create more drama throughout this environment by doing things with height. We can create volcanoes and very tall mountains, or make sure that the mountains are very jagged and immediate, perhaps not even have this sort of flat horizon thing, but really immediately go straight up to the sense of huge scale. So the point is, we're really just going crazy here. We're mucking around, we're going mental, but you can see how immediately I've created the sense of dramatic scale just with these scribbles and using them in reference to one another, showing kind of how they compare to each other and getting this real sense of depth. So that was what I originally pictured in my head. It was what I first drew here on the left. Now the problem is, a lot of people often skip this concept sketches phase and go straight from style exploration to final concept, because through creating our style, through exploring that, we get a picture in our head and we think that's really cool and we go to create the final piece. But the problem is, we're not exploring the presentation in the same way that we've explored the style. We may want to explore it symmetrically and have the castle in the middle of the piece and have a different sort of view. So for example, I might want to view this from much closer to the castle. Let's say we want that giant gate and I want a huge looking gate, and let's do that by having a perspective, pulling it up off into the distance and warping everything around it. So we have these towers that are just towering and lumbering over the sides of this castle. And let's say the gate is open and we see the open gate, and this could very well be a very normal sized city gate. How do we convey that sense of scale? Well, we can do that by having that knight character that we first drew, but have him quite a bit smaller and have him a lot closer, and then have a few other knight characters. And as we pepper these throughout the piece, we can see that by the time they get to the actual gate, they're tiny, they're teeny tiny, and inside the gate we have a sense of scale as well, because we have an entire city viewable from inside the gate. In fact, we have layers of city, right? Still using this similar to a skyline in today's modern city look by adding these towering skyscraper looking buildings, but making sure we have the elements of a medieval design. So let's add these rigid blocky looks. These, I forget what they're called, but that's where the archers kind of stand and shoot out. So having them go around the larger sides of the buildings, and again, let's work with this futuristic element. So we want, let's say, a cog up here. Now this piece is looking very medieval and not very futuristic. So how can we change that? We want to take this piece and really add both elements to it. So we might want to do things like, quite drastic, like mix in power lines in the piece that we may not have initially planned, but we can see that by adding these, we get the immediate sense of technology mixed with our medieval world, which can really drastically and clearly show this combination, right? So we have these power lines kind of go out. We might have these power lines kind of branching around in different parts of the castle. We might have a Tesla coil sort of off here in the distance, and the sky being filled with electricity, just to show this sort of buzzing atmosphere around this place. We want to have roads that are very clearly defined, and then we also want to, let's consider things like having mechanical things on the top of the building. Let's say like an arrow or trebuchet, but a very futuristic sort of cog type thing. So we've got our elements of style, we've done our style exploration, we're mixing them all in and mucking around with the presentation. In this third piece, we might want to try something even closer into the city. Let's have towering buildings again, following this pulled up perspective like we have in our second piece, but instead having it an alleyway. So let's really pull along this idea of towering buildings. We've got an alleyway. We want a few other alleyways visible. So we've got this gap here going into another alleyway. And so how can we convey a sense of scale and show the style? We want to mix things in the mid to foreground that have elements of the medieval buildings that we're used to seeing. So for example, these thatched roofs or tiles and things like that, mixed with stylistic things like the windows. Again, because we have a sense of scale, we really want to layer these on. So let's have like a 3-story building here in the immediate area, and then layering on top of that building after building and showing how they go up to one another. And let's have cramped staircases that sort of wind around and on top of each other and go up and down the buildings with ladders. We have things like those vents that might be oozing some of that toxic waste, or we might have things like the steam coming out from the buildings. We might even want some pistons or cogs connected to the buildings. We want to make sure that we shade things in the foreground to be a little darker. So for this closer building, we might want to show the windows a light and everything else is quite dark. We want to show these things layered, and then we want to show in the distance that sort of horizon that gives that city-esque feel, really shade that in and gives that picture. And we might want that foreground character to be right here in the front, kind of facing forward. Again, really scribbly. I'm not going for anything refined at all. In fact, I'm going really loose just to get a very rough feel. In fact, I can zoom out. And it's better to stay zoomed out when you're scribbling along like this, so you can be loose, not worry about getting caught up in details. That's the last thing you want to do, is get caught up in details, because we're just going for the feel, going for the layout. And when I'm happy with that, we can just kind of see these things in comparison to one another and think, okay, what do I want to go with? Do I want to go with this left one where everything's very distant from the city? I'm going to say no, actually, to be honest. I'm going to not go with that idea because I think it's a bit too separate from my initial concept, which was this medieval technology mix, right? I think that's a little too medieval, and even this is a little too medieval, even though it mixes quite well with the concept, because I get more room to show the culture in the vicinity of it. I think this is actually the one to go. So I'm just going to put a little green tick here. So this is the one I'm going to go with. Now, it wasn't my initial idea. I found that through my exploration process, and that's why it's really important to open up to your concept sketches being variant and open and loose. So I'm going to go with an idea like this for my final concept. So now I know what direction I'm going with for my final concept piece, but that doesn't necessarily mean I know how it's going to end up. So I want to really lay it all out first in the simple sort of aspect before I get to the details. I'm going to do this by zooming out and getting very sketchy. So when I zoom out, I force myself to loosen up a little bit because I can't get into the details. And in zooming out, I just want to really rough out a few of the elements I want to keep from my concept sketch. Now, one of those is going to be quite a medium-sized horizon, medium to low based horizon with a bit of a curve on it, just to show that there's a bit of a curve of perspective here that we're seeing quite a lot. I'm going to add just a reference curve here, and I'm going to show a few perspective lines with a center line that's vertical. So just with a few of these reference lines, I'm going to be able to build my my picture around it. So I know I want a gate, and I want that to be the main part of this image. Now, it's an open gate, which must mean, of course, that there is a moat, very, 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 very large sort of bridge across it. That is the door of this gate. So I'm going to make the gate slightly smaller so I can show more perspective of the giant gate drawbridge. Okay, I want to show some of those wires hanging down, hanging onto that drawbridge, and it's got to be just huge. Now, this is a scenario quite clearly where we will be able to easily show a sense of scale. So for example, if I draw a person this size, we know that the gate's not that impressive. But if I draw a person this size, we think, oh, that's ridiculous. That's not even a person, that's a dot. Okay, so how do we make that realistic? Let's perhaps have a few loading stations where there are these buildings, keeping in mind again that this is a building that I'm drawing right now, this little area here with huge stair areas and lifts and lines of people waiting to get into the city, and have this line of people come all the way to the foreground and very quickly get bigger and bigger and bigger until we get to a character in the foreground. So we've got this head and torso, and then finally we get to very close people. So we can see that by the time we have a person in the foreground, let's draw this head here, bring it up and have a head and torso. We know that that's a person or a robot, right? Because we're going futuristic medieval. And this is a line quite clearly still of these robots. And And look how fast they shrink, to the point where we know that they're lining up for something, and we know that by the time they get to this drawbridge, they're teeny tiny things. So all these little dots that are on the drawbridge must be robots, must be little people. So that's how we can create a very clear sense of scale, where previously, if I had just those dots there on this drawbridge, you would have thought they were, I don't know, rocks. But now all of a sudden they're robots that are filling this giant robot city, where even one chain link on this chain holding the drawbridge down is bigger than the house that people are loading into, this loading center down here. And perhaps we want a few of these loading centers. Perhaps we want there to be a system of lines where people are kind of showing these robot papers to kind of get in onto the drawbridge. The drawbridge itself is the size of a city, but because it's a drawbridge, it has to function sort of as a road, you know, so we're creating a culture quite clearly just with the visuals that we're creating. Perhaps I want another gate between this and the very large gate, so we can show again a sense of scale by having a long gate with some towers, and showing the comparison between this seemingly normal sized gate and then this ridiculously huge gate off in the distance. We can see, oh my goodness, this is just over the top, right? And that's okay, because in this scenario, that's what we're going for. We're going for this over the top look. Now, of course, the final piece would be color, and would be, you know, conveying the sense of saturation and a lot more detail than I'm doing now. But I'm just going to kind of set up the establishing piece and leave it at that, because I don't necessarily have all the time in the world to do that. But you're getting the idea as to how I would go about this. Doing things like creating the iron gate at the top, but having it all very thin and wiry, because in reality it's so big that they would actually be thick and massive, but there's just so many that has to kind of make up the gate. Having a sense of perspective kind of pulled up by having the inner wall get thicker as it gets taller, just to show that it's really being drawn off into the distance. Showing the fact that this sense of scale extends inside, so that the city horizon is only this big. And that we have giant towers in amongst this, perhaps, or that the wall of this giant city can be seen in the very distant horizon. Perhaps there are mountains inside the city itself. You know, there are all these kind of things that we can do to convey a sense of scale, to convey the sense that these styles are mixed. So having that cityscape look, having the castle wall off in the distance. Remember to, when working with shade, that things, especially in concept images that are closest to you, are quite dark. So these robots are going to be very dark and filled in, whereas off in the distance they're going to be much more faded. So if I take a brush and make it, let's say 65% opacity, and erase all this in here and just see how faded it becomes, that is a very clear, simple sort of way to show how sort of off in the distance it is. So if this whole piece were like a color, that over there would be very light and desaturated, whereas this here would be thick and rich and saturated and dark. Let's have things off in the base of this tower. Let's have those Tesla coils sort of building up, having some electricity, some lightning off in the distance, and let's have some power lines kind of extending into the city. Another thing you can do to show a sense of perspective and scale is to have a window down at the bottom like this, and then have a few more up in the middle, and then as you go up, have them get smaller and closer together, and we can see the immediate sense of scale there. So having that be drawn out, and we can see how everything's really branching up. So there you go, we've got the basic sort of image there, again mixing in elements of the futuristic thing with the medieval thing to make sure that our initial brainstorm is met. And that's after we've got it all laid out, is where we zoom in and we start shading and adding detail and doing all that stuff, and we follow and we get the final concept piece. So that is my tutorial today on creating an environment and designing an environment from the initial brainstorm and research aspects through style exploration and concept sketches until we get a final concept that we're happy with, that represents what we've got. And these concepts can be used and be given to other art departments that might be managing it or creating it into reality, or you might be the art department yourself. You might be creating a concept for your own use to work with in making an animation or something like that. But it's a very important process. It's as important as the character design process. So I hope this video has been useful. Thank you very much for watching. Once again, if you're interested in entering that competition, check out the link in the description to go over to By Artists for Artists and check out the environment design competition. Otherwise, thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen, and until next time, I will see you later.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you enjoy my videos. You can download the reference files from this tutorial by clicking the link in the description. And remember to share any art, animation or game you make on Newgrounds.com. Until next time, see you later.